Hi there, it's Christy with the Chirp YouTube channel. Welcome to this video. I am really glad you're here. I wanted to tell you a little story today about my own development as a speech-language pathologist and the opinions and the experience that I gathered over the years that shaped me into the professional that I am today. I figure this might help you if there are any other developing professionals out there who are still kind of looking for a frame of reference as they figure out how they believe it's best to provide services to kids. I, of course, did not always have the experience that I have now. And when I started out, I didn't have any opinions at all. All I knew was that I was supposed to help this batch of kids communicate better than they did when I met them. And that seemed like an overwhelming task because graduate school, believe it or not, did not prepare me to do it. Especially the graduate school experience that I had, which was very focused on communication disorders such as phonological disorders and articulation disorders. In spite of the fact that this is my field, I was not interested in either of those two areas, and I knew that I also did not want to work with adults. I knew that I wanted to work with a younger population, and yet my graduate school experience did not teach me how to do that, which seems really strange, especially to those who haven't been to graduate school. But graduate school is very much about theories and not about practice. And believe it or not, there were not very many classes that I took on developmental disorders. I learned a lot about language disorders, but I did not learn about developmental disorders and how they affect communication. And more importantly, how they affect engagement, which is what eventually leads to communication. All of that is stuff that I learned after school, which seems crazy to me because it puts upon the professional the responsibility of teaching herself pretty much everything that's valuable in her practice. But that is what I did, and a lot of providers that I know have done similar things. The problem is not all of us have time to read the research and read all of the books that we can get our hands on and figure out what actually works with the kids we serve. A lot of times we're just shoved into schools and told, here's your caseload, do what you can. And so we buy workbooks and we buy flashcards and we buy supposedly fun board games, and the kids pretty much dislike them all equally. And we can try to make it fun by giving kids prizes or by having motivational sticker charts. But for the most part, it's still work, it's not fun, and only our most typical students learn that way because they're able to have some self-control. I was working with kids who did not have that self-control. I was working with children who were already delayed in every area and who did not have the ability to muster up self-control to play a game with me or to do flashcards. It just didn't happen, and it wasn't about to happen. What I learned in school was a theory of practice that I'm going to call discrete trial teaching, sometimes also called discrete trial training. And I hate it. I don't think it's useful for most of the students that we work with, and I think that it should be phased out. It is not effective. Discrete trial training is when we look at the child, we figure out what he doesn't know, we take the most basic of those things and we try to teach that one thing in isolation. This kind of training depends on a lot of rewards, and they are external rewards. So I would ask, if I'm working on having the child be able to differentiate between red and blue, I would hold up two cars and say, show me red. And the child would either show me red or not. If the child does show me red, I provide an M&M. I must provide a disclaimer here that I don't endorse giving kids M&Ms, and I don't endorse rewards that are external in most circumstances. We want to teach children to communicate because it's intrinsically motivating to them, because people are interesting, because what they're doing is interesting to them and they want to participate in it. So all of that to say, this is discrete trial training. We teach skills one after the other in isolation. You can see that there are lots of problems with this approach if you think about it clearly. One way that discrete trial training has been sort of codified and used as a system for teaching children with autism spectrum disorders is a program called Applied Behavioral Analysis. And it is almost exactly what I told you. Usually at the very beginning, kids would sit in a booth with one child, one adult, and the adult would do trials. So show me red with 2 cars, show me red with 2 blocks, and count how many the kid got right and how many he got wrong. And it, as you can see, is very easy to measure. It's very easy to say, we first started, he got 0 out of 10 correct, and this time he got 9 out of 10 correct. So now he knows what red is for sure, we know that. Okay, well, in that booth with that one adult, the child is able to choose red. Does the child realize that red is also the color of your cheeks when you have been out in the wind? Does the child realize that red is also the color of a clown's nose, or does he think it's just the car in the block? We can't test those things. This is a problem known as generalization. Children who are trained in a discrete trial training method have an extremely difficult time with generalization. As this program developed and as they realized that that was a fault of the method and the design, they changed it, so now they stamped onto the end, oh yeah, by the way, there's this extra phase now that we call the generalization phase, where we work on expanding this skill into the child's regular life. The problem is that it still requires all sorts of adult support to get the child to use those skills learned in isolation in the real world. That is not the kind of training that we want. And in fact, in England, I believe, in the UK somewhere, a grown-up person with autism has sued the medical providers who treated him using this type of discrete trial training because he said it was child abuse. He was being forced to robotically give his questioner the answer that the person wanted over and over and over. Usually, providers of this type of therapy will recommend 40 hours a week of this sort of treatment. That is child abuse. Can you imagine when you're a little kid, 40 hours of doing that sort of meaningless, non-relational, not fun sort of work? It's horrible to think about, and I'm glad that that adult came out and said what the truth was, because in this country, in the United States, that sort of treatment is considered still to be the gold standard. If you got 40 hours a week of applied behavior analysis, discrete trial training, wow, you have the best treatment that you could expect for your child. It's not true. I've talked in many videos about engagement and about how children and adults do not learn if we're not engaged in the topic at hand or in the situation that surrounds us. There's a good amount of research now that indicates that our inability to engage at a very early age impacts development. And it makes sense, because if I am a baby and I am an extremely sensitive baby who has a lot of sensory difficulties, I am very internally focused on that feeling of not getting my sensory needs met, of my mother's voice being too loud, of my father's voice being too deep, or it frightens me or startles me, or their touch being too rough, even though they're very gentle. It feels rough to me because my sensory system is poorly developed. I'm gonna shy away from interactions with them. I might close my eyes when they come nearby. I might cover my ears. I might just cry to block them out. These things prevent me from engaging with the world. If I am blocking out my surroundings, I'm not learning from them. I'm not learning how to greet my mother in the morning. I'm not learning how to get my own needs met. I'm not learning how to keep myself calm. I miss out on many stages of development because I am focused on something else, my own internal state. If we can prevent that from happening by recognizing at an early age that the baby has some differences and here's how we can work with that, perhaps some of these disabilities like autism would not develop. The sensitivities, the differences may be there from birth, but the delays might not need to be. It may be that the social delays and the language delays are because of the initial lack of engagement, rather than that the child has autism from birth or from vaccines, although that is definitely not proven by science, just as an aside. And therefore, of course, it's understood that she will have language and cognitive and social delays. The way that this kind of all came together for me was listening to lectures by Stanley Greenspan and reading his books. This is probably the one that I would recommend to anyone who's kind of new to this whole idea. And he introduces his model of treating children to address the underlying issue and hopefully prevent the delays that come along with that. Rather than just teaching one skill at a time, he talks about working with the entire child. And his model is called DIR Floortime. The DIR stands for developmentally appropriate. We treat the child at her developmental level. If she is 6 but is not communicating yet, we don't treat her as if she is a 6-year-old who is communicating. That is developmentally appropriate. The I stands for individual differences. We need to take each child as an individual. If I'm working with a child who has an extreme need to get proprioceptive input to his joints and his ligaments, and who is constantly crashing into walls, who is always wanting me to squeeze his head or squeeze his hands, that needs to be part of how I work with this child. In fact, that needs to be the bedrock, the foundation of how I interact with this child. The R stands for relationship-based. Brilliant Dr. Greenspan believes that we can't teach a child until we have established trust, until we have a relationship with the child that is engaging, that is fun, and that involves trust. This is not something that we typically think about, and it's definitely not something that I was taught in graduate school. This book takes you through the stages of development, starting out with self-regulation, which is the basis for everything else. If a child cannot stay regulated, then she cannot interact, she cannot be engaged with the world around her. And I'm going to go through all of those stages in subsequent videos, so keep your eyes open for those, because I think that they will be helpful to you in assessing where your client is, where your child is, and how you can move through that stage in a way that's respectful, that's fun, that's playful, and that is creative, to get your child to the next stage and then move through that one as well. There are not that many providers who do this sort of thing around. Most of the meat of the work in this method is teaching families how to interact with their kids in this way, in ways that are supportive, that are challenging, that are fun and engaging, so that the children want to keep on engaging with the world, with people, so that they realize communication is a joy, not a bummer. When I started working with kids in this way, I no longer had kids who ran away from time with me, who cried when I came in the door. In fact, when I started doing in-home therapy with kids, I was already pretty well versed in this method. And in my practice, I pretty much only took on new clients who were still nonverbal, because that's my favorite part of progress to be able to see, is to develop that little bud into a wide open blossom who can communicate, sharing thoughts, ideas, hopes, dreams. I think that is very rewarding, and so I tried to stick with the kids who were so far nonverbal. Once the child was able to request using a communication book, many of my clients would start saying, "I want Christy, please," during the week when I was not there, because it was fun when I came over. We had a good time. I paid attention to the child. I was interested in what the child was interested in. I was following the child's lead rather than trying to force my agenda on the child. And as I'm saying these things, you may be thinking, how is it possible to teach anything following a child's lead and letting the child set the agenda? I do not let the child set the agenda. I do not force my own methods on the child. And I will be talking about that a lot more in upcoming videos as well. But basically, I can teach almost any skill through almost any activity. If you think about it, why can't I teach red versus blue while we are playing cars? While we are playing with animal toys, or while we are coloring? We can talk about the different colors. I can have the child request different colors. It's not that hard to work these different teaching exercises into activities that kids want to do, that kids are directing during their own social engagement with the world. I hope that this made you think. It is not very easy to figure out what your worldview is when it comes to treatment models. And most adults, most parents, most grandparents, most professionals in the field of special education never take the time to sit down and think, what kind of treatment do I want to provide? How exactly do I think that children best receive information? Do I think that a child is a little mini adult? No adult would want this either. Who should sit 40 hours a week responding to flashcards or answering questions? Do I want the results of that, which is usually a very robotic child, a child who is able to answer questions when someone else initiates the question, a child who knows facts but doesn't necessarily know how to interact with people, who doesn't know how to play, who doesn't know how to make friends or be a part of a family. Those things are all very important, much more important than being able to answer questions and respond to flashcards. We need to train, we need to teach children how to be human, not how to answer questions. Not teaching them one skill at a time, but teaching the whole child all the time. Keep your eyes open for the next videos on this topic, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. I'll see you soon. Bye.